Hello, my name is Jet Smith, and welcome back to my channel. This is a place where I try to give as many free resources as I can for speech and debate, and this video is all about how to do the reply speech in World Schools debate. So without further ado, let's get into what we're going to be talking about. So there's a lot going on in this one because I wanted it to be a comprehensive guide. There's like 20 something videos on the internet about replies, and they all have some good advice, but I want to make sure that we get the best advice. So we're going to talk about the basic responsibilities of reply, what your goals should be going into it, how to do an introduction, including how to deal with framing if it's still an issue. The main structure that we use for replies is giving two voting issues, and I'll tell you about the different options and ways that you can choose those two voting issues. We'll talk about what the structure of them are, how to finish your reply speech with a good outro, what mindset you should go in when giving a reply, how you should decide between the first and second speaker who can give the reply, preparing for replies in a prepared round before the tournament and during your hour of prep in an impromptu round, how to write the reply during the round, how to differentiate your reply speech from the third speaker on your team, what you can do to get better at replies in terms of activities and drills for practicing, and then lastly, how should we adapt our style in the reply speech. So if you didn't already know, the format of a World Schools debate is that there are 8 speeches, 6 constructive speeches, and 2 reply speeches. 3 people speak on each team, even though there can be up to 5 people per round, and either the first or second speaker will deliver the reply speech. So here are some things to know about reply speeches. Reply speeches are 4 minutes long, which means that they are half as long as constructive speeches. They require even better time management and prioritization and issue skills than a regular speech does because of that. They're also worth half as many points, which means they mostly exist to decide close debates or widen or shrink the margin of victory or losses in other debates. World Schools rounds are decided by team points. So if the points are close after the first 6 speeches, then they can decide it, or they can make your win bigger or your loss smaller, which can also help you with seeding and tiebreakers at tournaments once you get to elimination rounds. Your job is to convince the judge that the interpretations of the round where you win make more sense than their interpretations of the round where you lose. The order of the reply speeches also flip. So the opposition reply goes first and then the proposition reply. Normally, it's always prop, then op. This creates a 12-minute thing known as the opposition block between the third opposition speech of 8 minutes and the opposition reply of 4 minutes, followed by the proposition reply at the end, so they get the first and last word as the proposition team. The reply speech can only be delivered by either the first or second speaker, so third speakers cannot give replies. You are replying to the debate that just happened rather than really furthering the debate. And no points of information can be offered by your opponents, nor should you take any if they did stand up during this speech. So what questions should we be asking ourselves in a reply speech? There are 3 main things you want to ask yourself. First, if the judge was going to vote for us, how would they justify it, and how do we make sure this is what happens in the round? Second, if the judge was going to vote against us, how would they justify it, and how do we prevent this from happening? Third, if the judge isn't sure who to vote for, how can we show that the decisions they make to vote for us make more sense than the decisions they could make to vote against us? And if you ask yourself those 3 things and get good at answering those questions correctly, then you will be a great reply speaker. So now, what is the main jobs of a reply speaker? There are 8 overall responsibilities. You're going to introduce your speech, finalize framing if it's still an issue, select your voting issues, show why the other team lost, prove that your team won, weigh the arguments that both teams are trying to win on, give a good conclusion, and then prepare your speech before the round even happens. So how do we do this? Well, here is the time allocation and structure of a reply speech that is 4 minutes long. You're going to have an introduction and talk about framing if needed, and that should take between 30 to 45 seconds. You're going to go through 2 voting issues that should each take between a minute 15 to a minute 30, and then you're going to give a rationale and outro or conclusion, which should take between 30 to 45 seconds. Now, there are 2 voting issues because the speech isn't long enough to fully develop 3, although you technically could. I would never recommend it. That's more of the third speech's job. And in terms of what your two voting issues are, there are 5 overall accepted, common, and useful structures. You can do their world versus your world. You can do the 2 actors, decision makers, or groups of people affected by the motion that the judge consider most. You can divide the round into principal arguments and practical arguments. That's my favorite. You can do the 2 biggest clashes or disagreements in the round, similar to a third or a second speech. And you can go over their burden, as in your opponents failed to meet their burden, and your team's burden, as in your team met its burden. Now, many suggestions say that your introduction and framing and outro should be shorter, but there's lots of stuff that typically you're expected to do in other strategy videos in the first and second voting issue that to me make more sense to do in the introduction and in the rationale. So technically speaking, you could get away with a 20-second introduction and a 10-second rationale or outro or conclusion, but that means the stuff I'm asking you to do in the intro and the outro would need to instead be done in the voting issues. So let's talk about the top 10 goals of a reply speaker. And I put these in order of most to least importance, but all 10 of them are still important. You need to provide a biased in your favor bird's eye view and adjudication or judgment of the debate for the judge. You need to identify and establish the winning conditions for the debate and prove that your team has met their win condition and the other team has not met their win condition. You need to prove that your team already has won the debate as of the end of the third opposition speech, not try to win it now with new substantive or refutative arguments. You need to give the judges 2 or, I guess, 3 different justifications for why they could easily vote for your team. You need to weigh your team's strongest arguments versus the other team's strongest arguments and prove that yours are stronger. You need to quiet the judge's biggest fears or your opponent's strongest objections to your case. You need to point out the most damning strategic failures and flaws of your opponent's case and their strategy in the round. You need to demonstrate your team's coordinated and unified vision and approach throughout the debate. You need to differentiate yourself with your third speaker and your team's world from the other team's world. And you need to widen your margin of victory if you're already winning or decrease the margin of your loss if you're already losing. So these are the goals that you should have when giving a reply speech. So how do we get started with a reply speech? First, let's talk about the introduction. Usually this is between 20 to 45 seconds. I'd recommend at least 30. Introductions are super important in world schools, even in the reply speech, but you have to be careful not to make them last too long. You need to get something out of your attention getter in terms of content, style, or strategy. You can't just have an attention getter or an opener to have one. Opposition introductions can typically be shorter because we just heard from your team. We don't need to be warmed up. And the opener should be something related to the debate itself, not just the motion in the reply speeches, because you are more debating the debate than debating the motion at this point. So the structure of an introduction is pretty much the same as any other speech in World Schools debate, but I would include dealing with framing in your introduction for the reply speech. So you're going to catch our attention, segue to the topic or the subject being discussed in the motion, remind us of your team line, thesis, motto, and read the motion, and then preview the structure of your speech with your 2 voting issues. Then clear up framing if it's an issue that demands separate attention from your voters. So how should we do an attention-getting device in the reply speech? There are 4 main overarching themes that I would go to for writing my introduction attention getter. You can give an overview of the round, a short but biased but not unfair overview of the contributions that each team made to the debate. You can present the key distinctions of each team. What did each team choose to focus on or do differently than the other team? What is the core disagreement or the fundamental place that both teams could not agree on their cases or themes in the round? And how does your team win that tug of war, although that's more of how you're going to segue. And then lastly, and perhaps most commonly, is to point out a big mistake by your opponents. Did their case or strongest argument not appear or make any sense until the opposition block when it was too late? Were there really big contradictions or disagreements between their own teammates or between the arguments they made that made no sense? Like the ideology between them? Did they fail to engage with a key part of your team's case all round long? Or were there structural issues in their case like missing warrants or being too US focused, for example? Pointing out and using any of these things as a way to start your reply is a surefire strategy for a successful speech. How do we go from that to the rest of the speech? Well, we segue to the overall subject at hand. If you gave an overview of the round, then explain why the judge prefers what your team contributed versus theirs. If you tried to distinguish both sides, explain why your team's focus, direction, or interpretation of the motion was better than your opponent's. If there was one big disagreement, explain why your team is winning that central disagreement. And if they made a big mistake, explain how that big mistake cost them the win and gives you the round. So then you're going to give your team's line, motto, or theme, which is essentially the thesis of the debate that you've been saying all round long. You want to segue to your team line and make sure you repeat the line itself word for word the same as your teammates all did. Don't forget to do this, even though it's the reply, it's still the overall thesis, and the reply should be proving your team's thesis. And if your reply can prove that your team line was true all along, then you've done a good job. Next up, you have the roadmap. There are no off-time roadmaps in World Schools Debate. You need to set up what the rest of the speech is going to be about, preview your 2 voting issues that are going to appear in the reply, and don't go super in-depth on your preview like you would in other speeches to try and save time. Now, we also will have to clear up framing if it's an issue, but most of the time it should not take separate time in the reply speech in 90% of the rounds, except for when it's used to weigh arguments or if it was the biggest issue in the debate. If you want to talk about framing, particularly in the opposition reply, it has to be because your team is pretty much guaranteed to lose if you don't win your framing, and vice versa for your opponents. If your frameworks are basically incompatible, then honestly, rather than trying to win your framing, I would just try to make one of your voting issues apply under their framing and one of your voting issues apply under your framing, or try to connect both to both frameworks. So here's an example of a proposition reply introduction that puts everything together that takes roughly 45 seconds on the topic, "This house would ban homework." School is the place where kids are supposed to learn math, English, and science. Home is where kids should sleep, relax, and bathe. Parents and teachers should be able to let go of work when they walk through the front door, and kids should be able to tell the difference between what they're expected to do in a classroom versus their own bedroom. But the opposition has blurred the delicate balance between a child's home and school life, tipping the balance of this debate in our favor. The proposition has won that homework doesn't work, so join us in proposing the motion, "This house would abolish homework." In this speech, I'll demonstrate why the proposition has won the debate on both a principled level and a practical level, so that whether you're voting with your head or your heart, you're voting for us. So that propositional reply puts everything together. It's going for a distinguishing each team style of attention getter, and it's going for a principle versus practical 2 voting issue structure. Now, another example would be from the opposition. Here is a different introduction you could do that is also 45 seconds. The proposition told you that home is for play and school is for work, but opposition would say that doesn't mean we get rid of recess or chores. They said that homework stresses out teachers, but we would say teachers are more anxious when forced to cram double the instruction and practice in half the time. And the proposition explained their belief in respecting kids' choices, but opposition knows that kids should eat their vegetables even if they'd rather not. At best, the proposition proved that homework is imperfect, and at worst have proved that homework must evolve, not disappear. Because we still believe practice makes perfect, we still believe you must oppose the motion, "This house would ban homework." In this speech, I'll prove why the opposition has clearly won this debate by first reviewing the devastating harms of the prop world, and second by showcasing the immense benefits of the op world. This introduction is different because it goes more for a overview of the round style attention getter, and it's going for a 2-world structure to their voting issues rather than principle and practical. So now that we know how to do introductions, the next step is to get to our voting issues, which should take up the bulk, roughly 2.5 to 3 minutes of our reply. The best way to structure your reply is to give the judge 2, maybe 3 different lenses through which to view the debate's most important arguments, both of which result in voting for you. So 2 different ways of seeing the round that they should take or could take, and you win under both. These voting issues should include your team's best arguments and your opponent's best arguments, but yours should be better than theirs. The 5 most common and strong ways to group your voting issues are: look at their world versus your world and explain why their world is bad while your world is good, so the judge should vote for you. The 2 most important actors or agents taking an action as a result of the motion, or stakeholders or groups of people affected by the actions taken in the motion. So you could do 2 actors, 2 stakeholders, or an actor and a stakeholder. You can also do the principal justifications and the practical implications of the motion and explain why your team is winning, whichever the judge prefers. Their team failed to meet their burden, and then your team succeeded at meeting your burden. Or you can pick the two biggest clashes, arguments, or disagreements in the round, similar to what you might do in a second clash speech or a third clash speech. But I would prefer that you do that one least of all compared to the other four options. So how do we choose which of these structures we want to use? Well, every single one of them is good for some motions or for some debaters. Certain structures will work better in a given round. My favorite's principal practical. Other coaches that are my friends prefer two worlds. Your coach might like their burden versus our burden. Internationally, two actors or stakeholders is really common. And you might really see that the debate was only about two arguments, so it only makes sense to talk about those two arguments. No one structure is always going to be perfect or always be terrible. With that being said, though, let's break down the reasons why you might choose or not choose each of the different structures available. The first structure is the two worlds option, and that means you are showing the judge why they vote for you by proving the harms and negative consequences that would occur if they voted for your opponent's world, contrasted with the benefits and positive outcomes of voting for your world. Now, there are lots of different types of motions in world schools debate. There's this house would, this house regrets, this house as actor, this house supports, this house supposes, this house prefers, and this house believes. There are also other really less frequent types, but those are the most common. Certain structures of a reply work better depending on the type of motion. Now, for a two-world structure, there has to be two distinct worlds, which means that it either needs to be a policy motion or a value, but there's like a regrets motion, or a two different worlds, one where we value X and one where we value Y. So that means that if you're doing a this house would, this house regrets, or this house as actor would take this action motion, two worlds is almost always going to be a great idea. If it's a this house supports or opposes policy motion, then maybe this will work. And if it's a this house prefers motion, where the thing that we are preferring creates two different worlds, one where we prefer it and one where we don't, then maybe this structure would work. I don't think that this house believes motions lend themselves very well to two world structures, unless in the motion it's this house believes the world would be better off if blah, 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 right? So most often you'll want to use not this structure for this house believes. The two-world structure is good because it clearly distinguishes what voting for each team means, causes, or results in, and what it looks like. It ensures that you focus on and prioritize the offense, as in the harms in their world versus the benefits in your world, whereas other structures might incentivize you to talk more about defense, which isn't as good for winning the debate. And it's familiar to judges of other debate types because lots of people will do this in the final focus or in the 2AR or the 2NR of public forum, Lincoln Douglas, and policy debate. The cons of doing a two-world structure is it can be hard to flow because it jumps around from issue to issue a lot, because sometimes your substantives were about why your world is good or why your world is bad, and same for your opponents. It can result in repetitive argumentation if the harms of their world are just the opposite of the benefits in your world, and it can be really confusing if it's not absolutely clear what the world looks like when they vote for you versus your opponent. So if you have an unclear model or counterfactual or countermodel or characterization, then the two-world structure might not work as well. So what can you do instead of the two-world structure? My favorite is the principal and practical two voting issue structure, which basically tells the judge to determine if the motion is principally justified or ethically correct, and then to determine if its practical outcomes or pragmatic effects are desirable or not. If it's justified or desirable, then you vote prop. If it's not justified or undesirable, then you vote op. Now, there are different types of motions, once again, that work better with this. For this house prefers and this house believes motions, this works really, really well. And it can work with every other type of motion. It just depends on the round. If it's like an economics or like a war-based motion that like is super not principally oriented, then it's probably not a good idea to do principal and practical. If you're not reading a principal argument in your case, but your opponents did, it's also not necessarily a good idea to do principal practical, because then you are emphasizing a part of the debate that you're not even really trying to win on. Now, the pros of doing a principal practical voting issue is that it helps you be persuasive in a pathosy way and a logosy way, whereas the principal is more pathos, the practical is more logos. It helps you layer the debate in favor of the principal if you're ahead on the principal. If you're winning on the principal part of the round and your opponents aren't, then getting the principal out of the way and making it clear that that's the first place the judge votes on can kind of sweep the practical arguments they're winning on under the rug. It also helps diversify your offense to appeal to different types of judges. LD judges or maybe more lay judges might be convinced by the principal side of the round, whereas the flow-based LDPF judges might be more convinced by the practical side of the round. The cons of the principal practical voting issue structure are that A, it's difficult to distinguish them if your principled arguments are hung principles, as in they're practical arguments that have moral, ethical, or feeling-based impacts. It can also result in lopsided or improperly time-managed arguments if the motion is way more principle than it is practical, or way more practical than it is principle. You might end up talking about a part of the motion for way longer than you should, or you say there's two voting issues, but you make one seem less important by talking about it less. And it can also be really difficult to prepare in round than other structures, especially impromptu rounds, because you don't really know what your opponent's principles are going to be, or how they're going to respond to your principle, or which side of the practical debate you want to talk about, because usually the practical gets more attention, so condensing that to just one voting issue can be hard. So what else can you do other than two worlds and principle practical? The common structure internationally that I've observed is isolating two key actors or stakeholders to examine. So you ask the judge to vote for your team based on the obligations, duties, responsibilities, or goals of an actor or two different actors, agents, or action takers in the motion who would carry out the motion. And you can also look at what the, towards of that actor, the actions, what would the effects be on the needs, rights, lives of the stakeholders or groups of people affected by the motion. So a lot of the times this looks like maybe your first voting issue is about governments and your second voting issue is about citizens, or your first voting issue is about schools and your second voting issue is about students, right? So who is taking the action in the motion and who is being affected by the action in the motion. So this works really well on this House would and this House as actor motions, and it can work on the other types of motions, but you have to make sure that there are clear actors and clear stakeholders. The advantages of this structure are that it can help you prioritize principled arguments over practical arguments, and it can humanize what voting for either team means for people in the real world. It's also good because it helps the judge what to do when both worlds have good things and bad things about them. This tells you, okay, well, what do we care more about in each world? Do we care about the people taking the action and what they're supposed to do, or do we care about who it's going to affect more? The disadvantages of this are that on broad motions, it probably means that you're going to drop certain stakeholders and actors in favor of others. It can be really confusing to follow if the actors or stakeholders are unclear, and it risks sounding repetitive if your third speaker based their three clashes on three different stakeholders, which is a really common way of determining what your three questions should be. So fourth option you could take is the two burdens structure, which is where if at the beginning of the round you set up two burdens or a standard of what each team has to do in order to get the judge to vote for them, you can make your first voting issue proving that your opponents did not meet their burden or failed to align their arguments to the standard, and then your second voting issue proving that your team did meet your burden and did align your arguments to the standard. So this can work on any type of motion as long as your burdens or standard are really clear and distinct. The benefits of doing this structure is that it's cohesive and easy to understand because you established it and have been telling the judge that this is their job from the beginning of the round. It can also make the debate seem way more decisively in your favor rather than close or leaning if the two voting issues are directly related to the thing you told the judge determines the winner before. And it gives you a really easy weighing argument so that you can say your voting issues matter more than your opponent's voting issues because yours are directly related to the standards or burden. The downsides of this is that standards are more common than burdens, and if you're just going to use a standard where each team is trying to meet the standard, then a two worlds comparison structure will make more sense because you're both going for the same thing. It's also not always a great idea because writing good, fair, clear, and specific burdens is pretty difficult and rare, and it's especially difficult to do that in impromptu rounds. And if the burdens are reciprocal, or if the proposition just has to do the opposite of what the opposition has to do and vice versa, then the arguments on each side of the voting issues might just sound really repetitive. The final option that you have, which I would not recommend doing, unless maybe your third speech is choosing the issue-by-issue rebuttal style rather than the three clashes style, is to boil the debate down to its two largest arguments or core disagreements and prove why your team is winning on both of them and therefore is winning the round as a whole. This is technically compatible with any motion wording as long as the motion came down to two main issues. Now, the pros of two main clashes is that it simplifies the decision for the judge and it's really easy to Just pick the two most important arguments. It ensures that there's proper time to develop your strongest arguments and attacks, and it's similar to other debate formats like PFLD and policies voter speeches. You can also pick your opponent's strongest argument as one clash and your strongest argument as one clash, which really helps make sure that you're getting through all those responsibilities and goals of a reply speaker we talked about before. The reasons I don't like this structure is because it's really hard to differentiate yourself from your third speaker without just dropping a clash or making it seem like your third speaker picked 3 clashes when they really only needed 2. You also risk dropping really important arguments that don't fit cleanly into the 2 main arguments. And it's not very rhetorically persuasive, stylistically interesting, or common in world schools debate. So World Z judges might, not like it as much. So how do you know what issue to put first versus second? Well, if you're doing 2 worlds or 2 burdens, I would put the reasons why the judge is not voting for them first, and the reasons why the judge is voting for you second. So their world or their failure to meet the burden first, and your world or your success in meeting the burden second. Because you want the last thing that the judge remembers to be how you won. Whereas if you're doing principle practical, I would always put the principle first because you're probably asking the judge to layer the principle part of the round higher than the practical. As in, if the resolution isn't justified, it doesn't matter if the effects are good. Or if the resolution is principally required of us, it doesn't matter what the consequences are. If you're doing one actor and one stakeholder group, I would put the actor first and then the stakeholder because logically it makes sense to go from the action to the reaction. If you're doing 2 main clashes or 2 different actors or 2 different stakeholders, it depends on what side you're on. If you're opposition, I would put the clash that your opponents are most likely to win on last so that the judge will have those objections in their mind as they listen to the proposition reply. Whereas if you're proposition, I would put the clash that you are most likely to lose the round on first because the judge just heard about why they should vote there before anything else for 12 minutes. So you need to get it out of their mind as soon as possible. So what are these 2 main voting issues? Now that you know that you're going to pick 2 main voting issues and there's 5 different styles of how to select them, what is a voting issue? How do we go through the voting issue? What are we actually going to be saying? Well, there's 6 steps to the 2 voting issue structure, and these components are very similar to what you'd be doing in a third speech on a clash, but they're condensed. So you're first going to name the voting issue or tag it, then you'll refer to your opponent's best arguments on the issue and remind the judge of how your team defeated those arguments. Then you'll refer to your team's best arguments on the voting issue and remind the judge how you defended it against their attacks. Then you'll prove that even at their best version of their best argument on this voting issue, what you're winning on the issue outweighs what they're winning, or what they're winning isn't enough to win your opponents the round, but it is enough to win you the round. So now let's talk about how we tag the argument. You're first going to name the voting issue based on the structure you chose. So their world, the principle, first main issue, the actor in the resolution, right? Give us a clear name of the clash, but it should be short. Bad examples of this would be the first voter for the proposition is dropped arguments, because that could mean anything. Or vote for the opposition, because our first substantive second layer of analysis about how banning homework will make teachers more stressed out because it's bad because it's too hyper-focused and long. Good examples would be the first major voting issue for the proposition is the motion's principal justifications, or the first crucial reason you're voting opposition is because the prop's world is utterly undesirable. So after we've named the voting issue, now we need to signpost what our opponents brought to this issue. So you need to get out of the way what your opponents are trying to win the voting issue on. Briefly flag the first best 1 to 2 arguments that your opponents have presented that they could try to use to win this voting issue, and this should take you 5 to 10 seconds, and you can follow these 4 pieces of advice for how to do it well. Some good examples of signposting your opponent's arguments on your voting issues are, on the principle level of this debate, the opposition has told you that the motion is unethical because it violates the autonomy of teachers and schools, or the 2 benefits that they've told you occur in the proposition world are building a love of learning and increasing students' free time. So you want to be charitable, be kind, give the version of their argument that doesn't sound bad automatically, but don't build the argument or repeat the argument for them. You're just trying to make sure the judge knows what you're about to take down. The third step is to continue to refute their argument or show how your team has refuted this argument. Why is their offense or their possible way of winning the voting issue incorrect or implausible? This means giving your team's best 1 to 2 attacks on their best arguments, which should take you between 15 to 20 seconds. This can be dropped responses if they're really good, your attacked responses if the way that they were attacked was insufficient or if they were defended well. You can't really make a new response unless you are refuting a new response response to your response because the opposition block gave the prop something new to say. You also need to be charitable, so focus more on proving why the argument isn't 100% false, but why it's not true enough to make a difference. Some good examples of this would be, but even if kids should use homework for practice, they don't. One, Joseph told you that they refuse to do it often. And second, I told you that many kids don't have the home setup that makes practicing with homework possible, like internet or quiet space. Another way to do this as a good example would be two problems with this principle. First, schools don't have an inherent right to make any choices they want. Abby proved that through bans on corporal punishment and racial segregation. And second, teachers can still choose to give kids optional ungraded practice assignments. So you're just reminding the judge of the two reasons why their winning ability on this voting issue is gone. Step 4 is to extend what your team has said on this voting issue that wins it and is a reason why you are going to win the whole debate. So you remind the judge of your biggest and most important impacts of voting for your team on this issue. So it's not that you skip over the status quo or the way that the motion affects the issue to create your impact, but you want to be more impact-centric than your previous speakers were. And this should take you 15 to 20 seconds. Some good examples of extending your voting issues or your offense on the voting issue could be, Jordan, Joseph, and I have one that kids will learn to love learning again in the proposition world because it sparks their curiosity rather than dominating their home life, which means kids will participate more in school, have fewer behavior problems, and choose to study on their own. Or, Abby and Sky proved that the principle of respecting autonomy must be upheld by this house to uphold our end of the social contract and avoid overreach. So that's what an extension on a principle might sound like. Then you have to rebuild your arguments, as in, if they've been refuted, show that you have defeated that refutation. Or if there's new refutation because you're the proposition reply, defeat that new damaging refutation. This should take you between 15 to 20 seconds. Again, if they dropped your best defense, bring it up. If they made a bad attack to your best defense, bring it up. If you need a new response to their best attack, bring it up. But only focus on what's absolutely essential. An example of this would be, the opposition's only resistance to this argument is that no homework means teachers have more time in class with the same amount of time, or more to do in class with the same amount of time. First, Abby told you this simply eliminates the free or wasted time so prominent in classrooms today. And second, I demonstrated that teachers won't have to grade homework during the school day anymore, which frees up time too. The sixth and final step of the voting issue is to weigh your best argument on it versus their best argument on it and prove why their best isn't enough to give them the win and your best is enough to give you the win. So you should pick 1 to 2 reasons or weighing metrics that your argument outweighs on and prove that those are the most important weighing metrics. So there's 10 different weighing metrics that I've isolated in the third speaker video. I'll more gloss over them here, but if you want a full in-depth explanation, look at that video. So when you're looking at impacts or consequences, you can focus on size, which has to do with magnitude or how many people are affected, scope, which is the variety or types of people affected, and severity, which is how intensely, badly, or goodly are they affected. You can also focus on probability, which is the likelihood that the impact happens or won't happen, time frame, which is maybe short-term versus long-term versus reversibility, uniqueness, which is what is inherent to the motion or is only fixable or avoidable with the motion or without doing the motion. You also have prerequisiting, or does your impact cause or prevent or strengthen or worsen their impact. So you can pick one of those or 2 of those, but you can also pick for your 1 to 2 weighing metrics, something to do with framing. Does your arguments apply back to the burden or the standard? This wouldn't make sense, obviously, if your whole voting issues are the burdens or standards. But you can also talk about actor responsibility. What is the obligation or duty of the actors or agents in the motion? Again, you might be doing this the whole time if you picked actors and stakeholders as your structure. You also have stakeholder prioritization. What groups or types of people or interests should matter most or should we protect first? And you can also focus on what type of motion is it and use the wording of the motion to prove why your arguments make more sense or are stronger because of the wording of the motion. Lastly, you can do meta weighing, which is comparing your principle to their principle or comparing the principle part of the debate to the practical part of the debate and vice versa, and explain why it might come first or second. So you need to pick 1 or 2 of these 10 different ways or more than 10 different ways of weighing, prove that your arguments outweigh their best arguments according to that metric, and then prove why your weighing metrics are better than theirs or that your weighing metrics are the same, but you're coming out ahead. So, what should you think about when you are doing a voting issue on the principal level, or even if you're not doing principal practical, but just one of your voting issues happens to be about the principal part of the round? You need to name it something like what's principally required, or the principal, or is the motion just, or something like that. Refer to their principal if they have one, or their attempts to win your principal. Then prove that they didn't meet their principal and they didn't meet your principal. Then refer to your team's achievement of your principal or your team's achievement of their principal. Prove that you do achieve yours and theirs by answering their attacks, and then weigh your principal as more important than theirs, as in justice is more important than freedom, or that your attempts at achieving justice on your side of the motion are better than their attempts at achieving justice on their side of the motion. And you can tell us why the principal part of the debate has to come before the practical part of the debate. So, what are some things that we should think about or consider as we are preparing our two voting issues in the reply? There's 2 slides with this because there's a lot to think about. First up is charitability. You need to treat their arguments like a judge would. Most judges won't believe that your opponent's points are 100% false or 100% true. You need to differentiate between their weaker and their stronger claims. You need to consider conceding weaker arguments and granting them assumptions so that you can show that you're being a reasonable person like a judge would. You can't really make new arguments, but you can respond to new arguments, and you can make new weighing or prioritization arguments. You can change how the judge thinks about the content given in the first 6 speeches. You can't give them more content to think about. So you can also use framing strategically. The framework that was set up, your definitions, observations, standards, burdens, model, counterfactual, set up by your first speaker, can be useful in trying to diminish or outweigh your opponent's arguments and make it clear what happens when the judge votes for you. Don't forget to use these if they're useful and have been extended. This is where I'm saying you don't necessarily have to talk about framing separately, but framing can come up in your voting issues under weighing or extension of your arguments, or even as part of refutation. You need to make sure you're connecting arguments back to the ballot. Explain why winning an argument means that you win the debate. Just because you won an argument doesn't matter if that one argument is less important than other arguments, or if it only gets determined after something else gets decided, like the principle. Next up, you should prioritize offense over defense. You need to spend more time explaining why your team won and less time explaining why your team hasn't lost, and vice versa. You need to spend more time explaining why their team lost and less time explaining why they didn't win. So focus on offense, the overall consequences that will definitely occur, whether the judge votes for you or for them, not mitigating the consequences of voting for you or voting for them. Remember that dropped arguments are not silver bullets in world schools debate. You shouldn't spend a lot of time harping about a dropped argument unless it was A, actually truthfully dropped by the other team, and B, was extended by every person on your team, and C, is enough to outweigh everything else. Otherwise, don't really just talk about the argument as a winner because it was dropped. Talk about it as a winner because of how important it is. Next, you should try to beat them at their own game. Whatever weighing metrics they tried to use to outweigh your arguments, A, you should beat them on those metrics, and B, prove that your weighing metrics come first, i.e., if they went for magnitude, you go for probability and prove that probability is more important. Or as part of A, if they went for magnitude, prove that you also win on magnitude. This is especially good as a proposition reply because you know what metrics they're going to use because they already made them. And lastly, be sufficient. You don't need to be a mile ahead on every issue, but you can't just be tied on the voting issues. Do just enough on each part of the voting issue to win it and nothing else, so that you have enough time to cover all of the most important things. So what should you do for your voting issues depending on whether you're giving the proposition reply versus you're giving the opposition reply? Well, the opposition reply comes first, and you have to avoid repeating 8 minutes of your partner's speech, but you don't get to talk to them after their speech, nor do you get any prep time immediately after their speech. You don't get to discuss with them during an opponent's speech to get ready for yours. You have to, as soon as they're done, stand up, so they can't communicate with you at all unless it's before they start talking. You also have to preempt the 4-minute speech that is about to happen. Guess what it's going to talk about and defeat it before they can even say it. So what should you do? You should spend less time summarizing because the judge just heard about your team's offense for 8 minutes a row in the third opposition speech. You should spend more time weighing because the third opposition is winning the arguments and you are using those winning arguments to prove why they win the debate. You need to be preemptive. Anticipate and defeat the proposition's replies most likely ways of getting out of your arguments. And then lastly, you need to talk with your third opposition during the second speeches so that you can get on the same page sooner rather than later. The proposition, on the other hand, has the difficult job of answering 12 minutes in a row of opposition material. The good news is a lot of people are terrible at the opposition block. Either the two speeches contradict each other, so they don't really support one another, or the oppositional reply is so repetitive that it's really more like 8 to 10 minutes of content versus 12. But you have to spend a little bit more time summarizing because the judge may not remember what your team was winning before the block because they haven't heard from you in so long. You need to be more rhetorical because it's the last thing the judge hears is your speech, so it has to be the most memorable. You also need to respond to any strategic shifts or new arguments or new refutations or new characterizations that's coming out of the opposition block because your speech is the only one that gets to answer it. You also need to talk with your third proposition speaker during the second opposition speech to ensure that you know and trust what your third speaker is going for to set you up for a successful reply, and so that you don't plan your reply and then listen to their third speech and go, oh, none of the stuff that I wanted to talk about I can anymore because they dropped it. So how do we finish the reply? Now that we know how to do the voting issues, regardless of what side we're on or what structure we chose, how do we finish a speech? The outro, in my opinion, might be the most important part of the reply, and it should take you between 30 to 45 seconds. Some people will say that it should take you as little as 15, but that means some of the stuff I'm about to tell you has to happen in the voting issues instead, which I think makes it less memorable and more likely to get lost in the scuffle. But a lot of the times people skip their outro because they run out of time, but skipping them is bad for your style, your content, and your strategy, as listed here as I've talked about in other videos. Outros are really important for the reply because the last 30 seconds of your speech should basically be word for word how the judge decided to vote for you and how they would begin the writing of the ballot and how they would begin their oral critique in terms of explaining their decision. So what are the parts of an outro? There are 6 parts of an outro in a reply speech. First, you need to get to the crux of the debate. What did this debate boil down to? What was it actually about? Then review your 2 speeches' voting issues. What 2 lenses or views on the debate did you give the judge in this speech to prove why your team wins? Then you're going to summarize how your opponents lost, either a major mistake or an ineffectively answered or defended argument that cost them the round. You're going to summarize how your team won. What major success or ineffectively answered response or arguments by them won your team the debate? Then you're going to weigh your best argument versus their best argument. What have you done to show that even if the judge believes 100% of their best point, they still lose the debate and you still win? Finish then finally with your team's line, thesis, or motto and your stance. So because we blah, 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 we propose or oppose. So here is an example of a proposition reply outro that is 45 seconds long, which I know sounds like a lot, but it truly is essential to convincing the judge and getting what you want from them. One question can decide this debate. Does homework help more than it hurts? And the answer is no. We've won that the motion is principally justified, and we've won that the motion is pragmatically desirable. The opposition was unable to prove that homework actually helps student learning due to avoidance and cheating. But the opposition was able to prove that demonstrating how abolish homework helps students love learning, respect parents' choices, and reduce teacher burnout. And even if homework helps students learn more in the short term, its abolishment encourages greater long-term learning by improving the quality of instruction, absorption of information, and study skills in students. In sum, the proposition has won, that homework doesn't work. So whether it's your head or your heart telling you to do so, listen to them and vote proposition. So that outro puts everything that you just talked about in summation for the judge without sounding too repetitive, and ensures that if they got lost in the sauce, if they were too busy typing on their ballot, if they weren't really listening, that at the very least, the last 45 seconds of your speech snaps them back to attention and either guarantees they vote for you or makes them think twice about voting against you. So what should your mindset or your attitude be in a reply speech? I've got 6 things that you should be thinking about in your reply. First, you need to think like a judge. You should sound like you're giving an adjudication or an oral critique as a judge who's extremely confident in their decision to vote for you, but acknowledges that the other team did some things well as well, and knows that your team almost lost the debate at some places, because that's a realistic way of a judge would thinking. You also need to think past tense. Believe that the debate is already over after the third opposition speech, and your job is more to comment on, critique, and convince the judge that your view of the round is the correct way to view the round. So see the debate as it did happen, not how you wish it would have happened. You also need to focus more on critique and less on summarizing. Think of your job as a film or a food critic, not a plot summary or someone who just describes what the food tasted like. You also need to focus on confidence. Be cool, calm, and collected. The judge has to believe that you believe that your team won the debate to also believe that you won the debate. They will not believe it more than you do. You also need to be very meta. You're not arguing over the motion anymore of whether it's true or false, but over the debate itself. You are debating the debate. And your reply needs to be so logical, so easy to follow, and so undeniably true that the judge could basically write it on the ballot as their RFD. That is your mindset going into the reply. Additionally, as part of your mindset, you should not undersell your performance. Don't think that your reply doesn't matter because it happens at the very end, because the debate was already over in your favor or their favor, or because it's worth half the points. The reply can flip a judge's decision in a close round, or it can make it so you lose by less or win by more, which will boost your team's overall point score, which boosts your seeding, maybe gets you a bye in the first elimination round, or makes you seeded against easier opponents in your break rounds. You also don't want to forget about your teammates. You are the only person on your team that gets to give 2 speeches, which means that you need to talk more like it's your team's 4th speech than your personal 2nd speech. Do things that each of your teammates would also be doing if they were the one giving the reply. Mention their contributions by name and ensure that at least one thing that each of your partners contributed in the round ends up in their reply, and give them credit for it. This can also get some judges who are waiting to score speeches until the end instead of doing it speech by speech to remember your partner's speeches better than they actually were and give you and their original speeches, your constructives, first, second, and third higher scores. Remember that it's really not over till it's over, that many debate judges who do other types of debate more than world schools will think of the reply less like a reply to a debate that is already over, and rather see it as the debate that, or the speeches that end the debate in your favor, like a final focus, a 2AR, or a 2NR in public forum, LD, or policy. They believe that the reply is what really determines who wins, rather than, just adding a couple of more points. You also don't want to check out because the reply might be a speech of lesser importance compared to your constructive, but you have to pay more attention after your original speech is over because you have to comment on the entire debate, not just on what happened before you, which is like only 2 or 3 speeches, or maybe 0 speeches if you're a first proposition speaker. Next, let's talk about who should give the reply. The first speaker can give it, or the second speaker can give it. So here are the advantages of the first speaker giving the reply. You get more prep time. If you are a first proposition speaker, you get 44 minutes during the round after your speech ends before the reply. But the second proposition speaker only gets 28 minutes after their speech is over before the reply. The first opposition gets 32 minutes, whereas their second opposition speaker only gets 16 minutes to prepare the reply. It's also easier to coordinate with your third speakers when you're a first speaker because you can discuss the back half strategy of the round during the second speeches before either of you has to get up and talk again. You also can demonstrate new skills, especially if you are a first proposition speaker. You can show how you can refute arguments, crystallize arguments, and weigh arguments, not just speak pretty and make arguments in the first case. This is particularly true of the first proposition because at least first opposition gets to refute. You also get the best bird's eye view of the round. You should have the best, most accurate, and comprehensive flow of the debate because you didn't have to focus on writing down what you wanted to say. You only had to write down what was actually said. Whereas a second speaker might write down 5 attacks and only get to 3 of them, you're only going to write down what you hear. It also helps you avoid being forgotten. Your speeches happened forever ago. Especially if you're the first prop speaker, and if judges are waiting to score until the end of the round, your first speech might be remembered more fondly if they are reminded of you at the end as being a great debater. But why might you not want the first speaker to give the reply? What are the disadvantages? Well, they might be more front half focused. They might overinflate the importance of what was said in their first speech rather than the second and third because they really liked their speech, or they really knew the content, or they got lost, or they think the debate should have been about their first 2 substantive arguments, even though it ended up being about the third substantive or their opponent's substantive arguments. You also have to think about pre-round prep. Most of what you're doing before the tournament and in your hour of impromptu is on building your team's case, not writing the blocks, not thinking of what your opponents are going to say, and not thinking about weighing. And those are the things that are most required for giving a good reply. So the stuff that makes a good reply isn't really your focus or detracts from your focus as a first speaker. It also asks for different skills. First speakers, when you need to get good at a first speech, what you're practicing is argument development, speaking with limited time to prepare, having great illustrations. Whereas a second speaker is focused on learning how to refute, manage their time, prioritize, anticipate arguments, and weigh arguments, which is more relevant to a reply speech. So you kind of have to do double duty in terms of what you practice and prepare when you're a first speaker that gives the reply, especially if it's on an impromptu motion. Now, what are the advantages and disadvantages of the second speaker on your team giving the reply? Well, first of all, you can think about pre-round prep. The block writing, front lines or extensions, and weighing prep that you do is applicable in your second speech and your reply speech, even just the mental side of it. You also are probably one of the best time managers on your team because the second speech has to do so much stuff in so little time, and the reply speech is the same way. So you'll be better at the time crunch speech. You also have a holistic understanding of the round because your first speech covered both teams' entire cases, or most of their entire cases, not just your team's first and second substantive arguments. You also get the best bird's eye view of the round because you should have the best, most accurate, and comprehensive flow, even as a second speaker, because you had to cover everything. Whereas your first speaker might get tuned out or might be helping someone prepare something or is focused on, giving points of information because they don't have to speak again necessarily. You do have to give a speech, so after all these other people. So you might have a better flow. You also maybe have more relevant skills because you practice defending, extending, refuting, and weighing every time you do a second speech, whereas practicing a first speech doesn't practice the skills needed for giving a reply. But what are the disadvantages of giving a reply as a second speaker? Well, you have way less prep time. You either have 28 minutes as prop or 16 minutes as op after your first speech to prepare. It's way harder to coordinate with your team, especially as the opposition, because you want to be discussing what the back half of the debate should look like at the middle point of the debate, but you're the one up there talking. So you can't discuss during the middle part of the debate with your teammate what the back half should look like if you're speaking, but also you're too busy focused on just getting ready to speak. If your third speaker, before you've even prepared your second speech, is like, hey, what's the back half supposed to look like? You're like, I don't know, I got to focus on getting us through the middle half. You also risk burying your first speakers if they're not getting points of information, especially they might be forgotten or scored lower because they didn't give the reply. And because you can only win the round as a team, it doesn't matter if, you'd give the better reply. If you don't get more points in the reply, then your first speaker loses by not getting it. You also might have an imperfect flow. Even if you should have a bird's eye view of the round, a lot of second speakers end up writing stuff down that they don't actually get to say. So you might not be able to remember, did I actually say this or did I not say this, and just plan on it. You can also get lost in the weeds because you try to focus on way too much as like the line by liner rather than telling a cohesive story, which the first speaker might be better at. So now that I've told you those advantages and disadvantages, what's my advice? Well, the truth is that it's up to you, and that might not be helpful. So for me, what I would tell you is, in theory, if both debaters, the first and second speaker on your team, are equally matched in the skills needed for World Schools debate, as in either of them could have given the first or the second speech basically equally well, if they're equally knowledgeable on the topic and they're equally good at giving reply speeches, I would have the first speaker do it. In a world where everything else is equal, have the first speaker do it. The advantages outweigh the disadvantages. But in practice, most teams are putting the debater with stronger skills relevant to the reply in the second speaker position. So in those cases, the second speaker should do it. I don't want to contribute to first speaker slander and say that the first speaker is the worst debater on the team or the second speaker is always the best debater on the team. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the stronger debater in terms of skills relevant to the reply usually ends up being the second speaker. So if there's a big gap in the skills relevant to the reply between the first and second speaker, then it makes sense for the second speaker to be giving the reply. So now let's talk about what you should be doing before the tournament on the prepared motions to get ready for your replies. Well, first of all, you need to work closely with your third speaker. What clashes are they seeing? What do they think your team's strongest arguments are? And what are they most worried about from the opposition? If you have those things in mind, just like the third speaker does, then you will be more on the same page and ready to give a reply. You also need to think about weighing metrics with your third speaker. For each side of the motion that you might give the reply on, what are your best arguments in terms of weighing? And what are your arguments best at on weighing? Are you the team with the most probable arguments, the highest magnitude arguments, the most principled arguments? What is your best weighing metric? And what are your opponent's best and most likely weighing metrics going to be? Can you also beat them on the scope part of the round or the uniqueness part of the round? Or are you going to need to prove that your weighing metrics are just more important than theirs? You also need to think about both sides' win conditions, whether it's the burdens or standards, or just the core of the topic, heart of the motion arguments. What must your team win to win the round, and what must their team win to win the round, so that you can anticipate what you're going to need to do and what you're going to need to stop. You also can plan your ideal reply before the tournament, even just as a practice exercise or to create a sort of template for yourself. Be extremely flexible in the round, but imagining that the ideal round occurs where your team does its absolute best against another team doing their absolute best, so they're making the best possible arguments and the best possible responses. What would your reply be about? Next, what about when you're at the tournament in an impromptu motion prep? So the 5 things you need to do in impromptu motion prep and in impromptu motion rounds, first is be attentive. The final strategy discussion period, or the last 5 to 10 minutes of an impromptu prep period, is crucial. You need to listen closely to your third speaker and your devil's advocate. You need to ask them questions to make sure that you're on the same page with their back half strategy, and adjust your content to set them up better. If they planned on you saying something that you didn't write down, then you've got to get it in there. If they're really worried about an opponent's argument, then you need to preempt it. So make sure that you are focused on getting on their level, because you've spent the first 45 minutes thinking about how do I be ready to give a speech in an hour or an hour and 16 minutes, not how do I win the debate in 2 hours from now. You also need to be humble. Even if you normally give the reply and you're best at the reply, if you are in prep and you straight up don't understand the motion, you don't get your teammates' arguments, or you don't feel confident in your ability to deliver on the third speaker's strategy and knock it out of the park, let the other speaker, if they feel more confident, give the reply. You should also be very calm. Impromptu motion debates and prep can be stressful because you didn't get to give a practice reply, but you did get to give a practice first speech maybe. Or on a prepared motion, you can give practice speeches before the tournament or in practice debates, but not in an impromptu round. The round might go in a completely different direction than you anticipated, and you might not really love the topic, but the judge should not see any of those things on your face or hear it in your voice or look for it in your content. You also need to be flexible. If the round isn't going how you expected, work with your third speaker via whispering or sticky notes while still paying attention to the round to adjust the strategy of your speeches to make sure that it's still relevant and doesn't feel out of place. And lastly, remember to be above it all. If you were a judge hearing this motion for the first time, without the hour in advance to think about it, where does your head go? And if all else fails, go to where the judge is probably already thinking and convince them at their base level assumptions. So what about in round, whether it's impromptu or prepared motions? How do you get the reply ready to go? These are the 7 things you need to be doing. Be flowing. You can't tune out or check out after your first speech. You can't miss major arguments, and you can't get lost. Your flow needs to be as good or better than the judges, because you are commenting on the entire round. And just like how you wouldn't want a judge who did a bad job flowing 3 of the 6 speeches, you need to have a great flow of all 6 of the first speeches. You also need to be a team player. Even if you liked your speech's substantive material or refutation best, you need to be objective about your partner's substantive material. Was it stronger, or was it handled worse by your opponents than your material was? If so, you need to make sure that you're prioritizing theirs, or at least giving equal weight. You need to be choosy. You have 48 to 52 minutes worth of content that you could reply to, but you only get 4 minutes. If it's not a round winner, a round loser for you, or weighing those arguments against each other, you got to leave it out. And think about it this way. Judges never use or cite out loud every argument in the reason for decision. They might be thinking about every argument, but eventually they sort out the ones that didn't matter, and they only talk about or write about the stuff that really did matter. Your reply can do that for them. You also need to be timely. Your speech is so short that you have to be very reasonable and realistic with how much you can cover in very little time. So say no more than is actually necessary, and write down no more than is actually necessary. You need to be super flexible. Discuss the plan for the reply with your teammates and be open to feedback before the round and during the round. You need to get on the same page as your third speaker, help them set you up for success, and be willing to take their direction as well. You need to be preparing. Even though most of the reply should be written in your opponent's third speech, and you definitely shouldn't start preparing the reply in round until after your first speech is given, you can still write things like impact overviews, a template to fill in the blanks on, or a closing line before your opponent's third speech happens. You should also be adjudicating. Figure out what the most likely, compelling, and reasonable justifications would be for voting against you, and determine what you need to do to defeat those justifications. Then figure out the most likely, compelling, and reasonable reasons to vote for you, and figure out how you guarantee that that's what the judge actually follows through on. Next, how do we differentiate ourselves from our third speakers? There are 4 things that we can see different between thirds and replies. The third speeches are constructive, the reply speeches are evaluative. Thirds are still adding new ideas to the debate in terms of refutation and weighing analysis, even if they don't make new substantive arguments. Your speech needs to take the ideas that are already there after the first 6 speeches, sort through them, and weigh them in order of importance. Third speeches are comprehensive, whereas reply speeches are decisive. The third speecher has to cover every major argument in the round, whereas the reply speech only has to cover and win the major arguments in the debate that the judge should be deciding the round on. The third speeches give clashes, whereas the reply speeches give voting issues. Whereas the third speaker is talking about where your teams disagreed in the debate, kind of chronologically, we said this, then they said this, then we said this, then they said this. The reply speech needs to turn those disagreements into conclusive reasons or ways of seeing the debate, that the only ways to see the round are ways of seeing it where you win. And even if you go for clashes, you need to repackage what was in their clashes into 2 different ways of seeing the round for the judge. Lastly, third speakers are still trying to win the debate outright, whereas reply speeches are trying to prove that you have already won. Your third speech should be spoken in present tense, and the reply speech should mostly be in past tense. The reply speech, or the third speech, is about disproving your opponent's arguments on a truth level or a turn level. But the reply speech says that even if their arguments were true, it doesn't matter because your arguments are more important, or their arguments don't get to what really is important. How can we practice and prepare to be the best speaker possible in a reply? Here are some drills and activities that involve watching rounds. First, you can self-insert after the third opposition. Flow a debate up until the third opposition or the 6th speech. Then give yourself 5 minutes of prep and deliver and record an opposition reply. Then give yourself 5 minutes of prep and deliver and record a propositional reply based on the round. Then watch the actual reply speeches and compare them to yours. And if it's available, watch the judge's reason for decision or oral critique. This gets you in the habit of giving reply speeches and helps you build your instincts and think like a judge. It also will help you if you flow, analyze, and judge just entire practice debate rounds, even if you don't give a speech. Practice flowing them, and then maybe after the third opposition, pretend like you're a judge and give a ballot and oral critique. Then watch and analyze the reply speeches and redo your ballot and oral critique. If it's super similar, then that means that you are correctly thinking as a judge, or that the replies went for what they were supposed to go for. If your decision is completely different, then that tells you, oh wow, there are things that the reply speech did that completely changed my mind, and you can emulate them. It helps you practice your flowing skills, your anticipating what the other team will go for skills, and it helps you think more like a judge. You can also do a mid-round strategy breakdown. So watch a round and stop after the second opposition speech. Ask yourself what each team's best, second best, and third best ways to win the round are, and what their opponent's biggest threat to those options are. Then watch the back half of the debate and see if they went for what you thought their best arguments are, or if you change your mind now. Do you agree still that you picked the best second and third, or did you miss something, or did they miss something? This will improve your round vision, your anticipation of opponents' arguments, your ability to prioritize between arguments, and your ability to preempt or defeat opponents' arguments before they even make them. What can you do in your own practice debates, regardless of like recordings? The best thing you can do is reply redos. After you get critiques from a practice debate, or after reading the ballot for a real tournament round, or after recording your practice debate and giving yourself a critique, redo the reply to be better at 2 or 3 specific skills or 2 or 3 specific arguments. You can also do hell reply redos where you only get 3.5 minutes to do it, and then 3 minutes, and then 2.5 minutes, and then just 2 minutes. And this will make you way more efficient and help you understand how to be, better word economy. And it also helps you cement your feedback from your coaches or from your judges and actually put it into practice rather than just smiling and nodding and then forgetting about it. You can also practice weighing considerations by looking at your flows from practice rounds or previous tournaments, and do your best to look at your substantive arguments and get them to outweigh every single one of your opponent's arguments on every single type of weighing. That can take a long time, but especially if it's a motion subject that you're going to debate a lot because it just happens to come up all the time, figuring out how do I make these arguments look bigger, stronger, and better than my opponents no matter how I have to do it, makes you really good at weighing. And then lastly, in a real practice debate, you can have a mid-round team meeting. Halfway through the debate, stop and have each member of the team independently think through and write down what they think the back half strategy or the reply should be going for. Then see if you're all on the same page. And if not, figure out what went wrong, how you can adjust, or how to get on the same page. This improves your team's cohesion, trust, and preparation skills. So last but not least, let's talk about style in the reply speeches, because that is extremely important. Here are my 8 C's of being a good reply speaker. You need to be charming. Focus on showing your personality, being likable, being kind, being relatable to the judge, and being reasonable. You also need to, 2, be confident. Appear cool, calm, and collected, and show that your reply is just stating the facts as they are. You are describing the debate as it happened. Third, be clear. You need to speak more slowly and simply than the previous speeches did to ensure that even someone who just walked into the room right before your speech gets what's going on. Fourth, you need to be convincing. Appeal to the most common types of average people, not yourself as the judge. How would the majority of regular people or regular people from different walks of life be convinced and convince them? Not like the typical teenager in the audience. Then you need to be compassionate. Understand that your opponents and judges are real people just trying to have a good time and learn, and talk to them and about them like you know that. You also need to be creative. Your judge has heard dozens of reply speeches and 8 speeches in this round. Figure out how to make yours stand out from the others. Seventh, be compelling. Have one-liners, rhetorical devices, and deliberate emphasis at points so that you can be truly persuasive. And lastly, I would say you should be comedic. This doesn't always apply, especially if the motion subject is really heavy, but without being rude or aggressive, if you can make the audience chuckle or laugh, then you're more likely to stand out and be impressive and get that win. So in this video, we talked about how to write the rationale for your victory, because that's what the reply speech is. You are giving the judge your interpretation of the debate that they can borrow to justify voting for you. And that means that you can get a close debate decided in your favor, you can win by even more, or you can lose by less, so that you're more likely to break and break far at tournaments. Hopefully this was helpful for you. This is the end of my series on the individual speeches in a World Schools debate. The next couple videos that I make will probably be along the lines of how do you do research to prepare for impromptu tournaments, how do you use your impromptu prep effectively. We'll talk about how to prepare emotions and write cases in World Schools debate. So there's still more World Schools content coming your way, and maybe there will be even videos analyzing the 2025 NSDA Nationals motions that come out. With that being said, I wish you all the best of luck giving reply speeches. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know, and share this with your teammates and your coaches and get it around so that we can make World Schools debate in Idaho and in the United States better than it's ever been. So with that, I'll see you in the next video.